At 0540 on the morning of June 7, 1944, Sergeant Henri Lecomte sat in the cab of a rusted Renault UE Chenillette utility tractor on the edge of a Norman apple orchard and listened to the sound of a German infantry battalion organizing itself for an attack. He was 31 years old, former agricultural mechanic from the village of Die-sur-Seulles. He had repaired farm equipment for 9 years before the Germans arrived in 1940 and turned his country into an occupied workshop. He had never fired an artillery piece in his life. He had never killed a man. He had never commanded anything larger than a field repair crew of 3 men and a dog that belonged to no one in particular. The machine beneath him was a Renault UE Chenillette. The French army had built 4,800 of them between 1931 and 1940. It weighed 2.1 metric tons. Its Renault engine produced 35 horsepower. Its maximum speed on flat road was 30 kilometers per hour. Its armor, if the pressed steel panels along its hull could be called armor, was 9 millimeters thick. It had been designed to haul ammunition and supplies across short distances in support of infantry units that had real weapons. The Germans had captured it in the summer of 1940, along with everything else. They had used it for logistics work behind their lines, hauling ammunition, towing light equipment across farm tracks that were too narrow, were too soft for their own vehicles. When it broke down, which it did regularly because it was old and worn and had been maintained by whoever was available rather than whoever was competent, German mechanics looked at it with the particular contempt reserved for things that are beneath contempt. They called it the Küchentraktor, the kitchen tractor, the kind of machine that belonged on a farm, not in a war. The gun mounted on it now had not been there yesterday. It had been there for 11 hours. The 20mm Flak 38 autocannon that Lecomte had bolted to the Renault's cargo bed weighed 420 kilograms. It had been designed to be towed behind a vehicle or mounted on a static position and used against low-flying aircraft. Its cyclic rate of fire was 220 rounds per minute. Its effective ceiling against aircraft was 2,200 meters. Its effective range against ground targets, against infantry in the open, against soft-skinned vehicles, against men moving across a Norman field in the gray light before dawn, was considerably more relevant to Lecomte's situation than its ceiling. The German battalion moving through the orchard on Lecomte's left was approximately 800 men. They were moving toward the beach. They had received orders the previous evening to push through Die-sur-Seulles toward the coast and hit the Allied landing forces from the rear. They were disciplined, experienced, and armed with weapons that had been designed for exactly this kind of mobile infantry assault. Lecomte had a farm tractor, a stolen anti-aircraft gun, 400 rounds of 20mm ammunition, and a mechanic's understanding of how machinery behaved when pushed beyond its rated capacity. He had also spent the previous 11 hours thinking very carefully about angles. To understand how Henri Lecomte came to be sitting in a stolen tractor with a stolen gun at the edge of a Norman orchard on the morning after D-Day, you have to go back to the 4 years that preceded it. The German occupation of Normandy was not the theatrical cruelty of the Eastern Front. It was something more mundane and in some ways more corrosive. It was the steady, grinding imposition of a foreign logic onto a landscape that had its own logic. German officers requisitioned farm vehicles for military use. They took horses. They took fuel. They took the better cuts of meat from village butchers and paid in Reichsmarks that were worth whatever the Germans said they were worth. Lecomte had watched this for 4 years from his repair shop on the edge of Tilly-sur-Seine. He had repaired German vehicles when ordered to, because the alternative was deportation to a labor camp in Germany. He had repaired them slowly, and not always correctly, in ways that were difficult to trace back to deliberate sabotage. A seal installed slightly off-center, a bolt torqued to a fraction under specification, small things that produced breakdowns at inconvenient moments and were never conclusively attributable to anything other than the normal entropy of machinery in hard use. He was not a member of the resistance in any formal sense. He had no radio. He had no contact with London. He was a mechanic who understood that machinery could be a weapon if you understood its tolerances. When the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, Lecomte heard the naval guns from 25 kilometers away. He heard them as a sustained thunder that had no weather to explain it, a sound that began before dawn and continued through the morning with the relentlessness of something industrial. He climbed to the roof of his shop and looked north and saw nothing except the faint suggestion of smoke on the horizon, but the sound told him what it was. The liberation had begun. What it had not begun with was Allied soldiers anywhere near Tilly-sur-Selle. The beaches were 25 kilometers north. Between the beaches and Lecomte's village was the entire depth of the German coastal defense zone and the reserve formations moving up to reinforce it. The men who had landed on Omaha and Gold and the other beaches had their own problems that morning. They were not coming to Tilly-sur-Selle today. They might not come for days. But the Germans were moving through it right now. Lecomte had watched them from his shop window throughout June 6th. Columns of vehicles moving north, then columns of vehicles moving south, as the situation on the beaches began to produce information that contradicted the Wehrmacht's initial confidence. Motorcycles with riders carrying orders, horse-drawn supply carts moving along the secondary roads, and in the late afternoon, a German logistics convoy that had been caught in a fighter-bomber attack on the road north of the village and had scattered into the fields. The attack left 3 German vehicles burning on the road. It also left, in a ditch 400 meters from Lecomte's shop, 1 intact Flak 38 autocannon that had been towed behind a half-track whose driver had driven into the ditch when the aircraft arrived and whose crew had run into the tree line and not yet returned. Lecomte looked at the gun in the ditch. He looked at the Renault UE Chenelette sitting in his shop yard. He had repaired it for the Germans 3 weeks earlier. They had not yet come to collect it. In the confusion of the Allied landing, apparently, a Renault UE in a French mechanic's yard was a low administrative priority. He looked at the gun again. Then he went to find his neighbor Aubert, who was 44 years old, had served in the French artillery in 1918, and still possessed the specific kind of knowledge that 26-year-old mechanical knowledge, plus a Flak 38 technical manual, could not fully replace. Aubert looked at Lecomte's plan and said it was the idea of a man who had lost his senses. Then he helped anyway. The Flak 38 weighed 420 kilograms without its wheeled carriage. Lecomte and Aubert spent the first 2 hours of their operation removing the gun from its carriage and loading it onto the Renault's cargo bed using a block and tackle arrangement that Lecomte had used to lift farm machinery for the previous 9 years. The gun fit onto the cargo bed with 30 centimeters to spare on each side. This was not comfortable. This was barely adequate. The Renault had been designed to carry ammunition crates and small equipment, not a 420-kilogram autocannon. Its suspension was worn from 4 years of hard use under German requisition. The rear of the vehicle sat noticeably lower with the gun mounted. Lecomte studied this. He adjusted the gun's position forward by 40 centimeters to redistribute the weight. The suspension equalized slightly, not perfectly, enough. Mounting the gun to the cargo bed was the engineering problem that consumed the next 4 hours. The Flak 38, in its original configuration, attached to a ground mount through a rotating base plate. Lecomte needed to attach that base plate to a Renault UE cargo bed that had been designed for tie-down straps and wooden crates. He did not have welding equipment capable of a structural weld in the field. He had bolts, angle iron from his shop's scrap pile, and a drill press that ran on the shop's electrical connection. He drilled 16 mounting holes through the cargo bed floor. He fabricated 4 angle iron brackets from scrap stock. He used German specification bolts he had removed from captured vehicle parts over the previous 2 years, each one sorted by size in coffee tins on his shop's shelves. He mounted the gun's base plate through the cargo bed floor into reinforcing plates he welded to the frame rails below. The reinforcement was not elegant. It would not have passed any military engineering inspection. But Lecomte was not building something for an inspection. He was building something that needed to work once in one morning, well enough to matter. Aubert worked beside him throughout the night. He explained the gun's operation from memory and from the technical manual that Lecomte had taken from the abandoned half-track's cab along with the gun. The Flak 38 was not complicated by the standards of heavy weapons. It was a gas-operated autocannon with a simple sighting system originally calibrated for aerial targets. Aubert had never operated a Flak 38 specifically, but he had operated the 25mm anti-aircraft gun in 1918, and the principles were similar enough that his memory was more useful than the manual. The gun had 2 firing modes, single shot and automatic. In automatic mode, 220 rounds per minute, the 400 rounds in the German ammunition crates that Lecomte had also removed from the half-track would last slightly under 2 minutes of continuous fire. This was not a sustained battle weapon. It was a moment weapon, something that could produce catastrophic effect in a short period and then be empty. Lecomte understood this. He built his plan around it. By 0300 on June 7th, the gun was mounted. Lecomte started the Renault's engine and drove it 200 meters around the shop yard. The suspension groaned. The vehicle moved. The gun did not shift on its mounts. He drove it back, shut it off, and sat in the cab for 10 minutes thinking about what he had built and what he was going to do with it. He was not a soldier. He had no military training beyond the 3 months of French Army conscript service he had completed in 1931 before being released because the Army had more men than equipment. He had no radio to contact the Allied forces to the north. He did not know exactly where the German battalion would move or when. He knew only what he had observed from his shop window over the previous 24 hours, that German infantry was moving through his village toward the coast, that they were using the road through Tilly-sur-Seulles and the parallel farm tracks through the orchards, and that they would continue doing so until someone stopped them. He drove the Renault to the edge of the orchard at 4:30 and positioned it behind the stone wall of an old cider mill that had been abandoned since 1938. The wall was 1.4 meters tall and ran along the orchard's eastern boundary. The Renault sat behind it with the gun barrel elevated just above the wall's top edge, invisible from the orchard floor, but positioned to fire down the orchard's central lane, a 200-meter corridor between the apple trees that was exactly wide enough for infantry to move through in column. Lecomte sat in the cab and waited. Aubert had refused to come. He had a wife. He had children. He had made his contribution in the night's work, and he would make no more of it. Lecomte had not argued. Aubert's contribution was essential, and Aubert's family was real, and Lecomte had no family to constrain him. His wife had died of tuberculosis in 1941. His shop was all he had, and the shop was occupied by men who had taken everything that was not bolted down. Some things he had bolted deliberately. This morning, he had unbolted them. The German battalion entered the orchard at 0547. They were moving in column, using the central lane between the apple trees, the same corridor Lecomte had identified from his position behind the cider mill wall. The leading elements were infantry with rifles and machine gun teams. Behind them, moving at the pace of the foot soldiers, 3 Kübelwagen staff cars and 2 motorcycles with sidecars carrying officers and radio equipment. Behind them, the main body of the battalion, 600 or more men moving in the disciplined but tired manner of soldiers who had been awake for 24 hours and were now being directed toward a beach they had been told would be manageable. Lecomte watched through a gap in the cider mill wall. The leading infantry was 180 meters away. He did not fire. He had thought about this during the 2 hours of waiting. A mechanic thinks in sequences, in the order of operations. You do not begin a repair job at the most dramatic point. You begin where the leverage is greatest. You begin where one action produces the most subsequent consequences. The officers were the leverage. The 3 Kübelwagen staff cars were 400 meters back in the column, behind the leading infantry, behind the 1st machine gun teams, in the middle of the formation where they were protected and from where they could direct the battalion's movement. If the leading infantry entered the corridor and the officers behind them were destroyed, the leading infantry would have movement without direction. A formation of infantry without officers on unfamiliar ground in the first hours of a major Allied landing was not an effective fighting force. It was a collection of frightened men looking for instructions that would not come. Lecomte let the leading infantry pass. He counted them as they moved through his field of fire. 80 men, 100 men. The machine gun teams with their MG-42s and ammunition bearers. He let them all pass. At 05:02, the 1st Kübelwagen was 90 meters from the cider mill wall. Lecomte started the Renault's engine. The engine noise was immediately audible to the men in the orchard. Several soldiers turned toward the sound. The leading elements of the battalion had already passed the wall. The main body was still entering the corridor. The 3 Kübelwagens were in the open lane, their occupants looking toward the sound of the engine with the attentive concern of men who had spent 4 years in occupied France and had learned to treat unexpected engine sounds with care. They had 1 second to process what they were seeing. Then Lecomte opened fire. The Flak 38 in automatic mode fired 220 rounds per minute. In the first 3 seconds of fire, the gun put 11 rounds into the lead Kübelwagen. The vehicle was not armored, it was a canvas-topped staff car. The 20mm rounds went through it completely. The vehicle stopped moving. The 2nd and 3rd Kübelwagen were 15 meters apart. Lecomte traversed the gun right and put another 8 rounds into the 3rd. In 11 seconds, he had destroyed the battalion's mobile command element. He had also fired 40 rounds of his 400-round supply. Now the complication. The leading infantry, 100 meters ahead, had turned back toward the sound of the gun. The main body, still entering the corridor, was in confusion. But confusion does not last. Men with weapons and training and the instinct to close with a threat would organize themselves within seconds. An experienced German infantry battalion did not require officer direction to respond to a single enemy gun position. The NCOs would take charge. They would identify the position. They would direct fire at it. Lecomte put the Renault in gear and moved. He drove north along the back of the cider mill wall, parallel to the orchard corridor, keeping the wall between himself and the German formation. The Renault's 35-horsepower engine produced a sound that was nothing like enough for the speed Lecomte needed, but it was all there was. He drove 80 meters north, stopped behind a collapsed section of the wall, where the stone rubble gave him cover on 3 sides, and opened fire again. This time he fired at the main body of the battalion, still entering the corridor. Men in the open, moving in column, caught between the burning staff cars to their north and the gun they could hear but not see to their east. The Flak 38 was not an infantry weapon by design. It was an anti-aircraft gun. Its 20mm rounds were designed to destroy aircraft structures. Against infantry in the open, their effect was total. Not because of the round's size, because of its velocity, its flat trajectory, and the simple mechanical fact that a 20mm shell traveling at 900 meters per second left nothing usable of whatever it encountered. Lecomte fired for 8 seconds at the main body of the column. Then he moved again. A mechanic understands leverage. He understands that a small force applied at the correct point produces movement that a large force applied incorrectly cannot produce. Lecomte had 400 rounds. Against 800 men, 400 rounds of 20mm ammunition fired with perfect accuracy would produce at most 400 casualties, assuming every round found a target, which no fire in the history of combat had ever achieved. Against 800 disciplined soldiers who had identified his position and concentrated their fire on it, Lecomte's advantage would last until the first accurate machine gun burst reached him, or until he ran out of ammunition. He was not trying to destroy the battalion. He was trying to stop it. Stopping and destroying are different calculations. A battalion that takes 40 casualties and continues its advance is not stopped. A battalion that takes 20 casualties in the first 30 seconds loses its mobile command element and finds itself channeled into a killing corridor with fire coming from changing positions is experiencing something different. It is experiencing uncertainty. It is experiencing the particular paralysis of a formation whose training assumes known threats from known directions and which is suddenly receiving fire from directions that keep changing. Lecomte moved 4 times in the first 22 minutes. Each time he fired a burst of 6 to 15 seconds. Each time he targeted a different element of the battalion. The leading infantry that had passed his original position had turned back and was now attempting to move through the orchard toward the sound of the gun. He fired at them from his third position, 60 meters further north along the wall, and forced them back into the trees. The main body had begun to disperse out of the corridor, into the orchard rows, seeking cover between the apple trees. He fired along the rows from his fourth position and forced them back toward the corridor. Each move was a mechanical problem. How far could the Renault travel in the time he had before the next German fire solution reached his current position? The answer depended on how quickly German NCOs could identify his muzzle flash, calculate his position, direct their MG-42 teams to that position, and achieve effective fire. From his observation of German infantry procedures over 4 years of occupation, Lecomte estimated this process took between 25 and 45 seconds from the end of his burst to the arrival of accurate return fire. He gave himself 20 seconds after each burst before moving. The Renault's engine made this calculation uncomfortable. 35 horsepower was not enough to generate the speed that 20 seconds of movement ideally required. Lecomte drove the Renault 120 meters south, back past his original firing position, to the corner of the cider mill building itself. This was a new direction of movement. The German mortar team's adjustment process would have assumed continued northerly movement. The south shift bought him time and a new angle. From the cider mill corner, he could see the orchard's corridor's southern entrance. The battalion's rear elements were still entering the orchard. They had heard the firing and had slowed, but they were still moving. The battalion's rear guard had not yet received orders, because the officers who gave orders were in the burning Kubelwagen in the middle of the corridor. Lecomte traversed the gun south and fired at the rear of the column. He fired for 12 seconds. The rear elements stopped. They reversed. Men who had been moving forward were now moving backward out of the orchard and into the open field from which they had come, which was exactly where the Allied fighter bombers that had been working the roads since dawn could see them clearly. At 0631, 2 RAF Typhoons arrived over the field south of the orchard. They had not been called by Lecomte. He had no radio. They had been directed to the area by their own patrol pattern. What they found when they arrived was 200 German soldiers in the open field south of the orchard, exposed and moving in disorder. The Typhoons made 3 passes. When they were finished, the German battalion's rear element had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. At 0644, Lecomte's Renault took a direct hit from a German Panzerfaust fired by an infantry soldier who had crawled along the stone wall from the north and found a gap 40 meters from Lecomte's position. The Panzerfaust round struck the Renault's right side. The vehicle's 9mm pressed steel was not armor. The round went through it. The explosion was contained partly by the wall and partly by the Renault's own engine block, which absorbed a significant portion of the blast. The engine stopped. The vehicle began to burn. Lecomte was thrown from the cab by the blast concussion. He landed 3 meters from the vehicle. He was conscious. He had burns on his right arm and a laceration across his forehead from stone fragments. His hearing in both ears was producing a single sustained tone that contained no other information. He lay on the ground for what he later estimated was 30 seconds. Then he got up. The gun was still on the burning vehicle. He could not use it. The ammunition crates were cooking off in the fire, 20mm rounds detonating randomly in the heat. Lecomte moved away from the vehicle and pressed himself against the cider mill wall. He had fired, by his own later count, approximately 280 rounds over the course of the engagement. He had changed position 6 times. He had been in contact with the German battalion for 57 minutes. The battalion was not destroyed, but it had not reached the beach. The leading infantry that had passed his original position had eventually worked their way around his northern positions and continued moving, but they had done so in dispersed order, cautiously, without their command vehicles, without their rear element, and 57 minutes later than their original movement schedule. In the context of the D-Day battle, 57 minutes was not a minor delay. The difference between a German counterattack reaching the beach at 0700 and reaching it at 0800 was the difference between striking a landing force still organizing itself on the sand and striking a landing force that had moved 2 kilometers inland and begun to consolidate. The British forces of the 50th Infantry Division, pushing inland from Gold Beach, would later record in their war diary that their left flank was secured without significant armored counterattack on the morning of June 7th. The diary noted that German forces in the Tilly-sur-Selle sector appeared disorganized and were slow to respond. The diary attributed this to Allied air superiority and artillery preparation. Air superiority had contributed. The Typhoons had been decisive against the rear element. But the 57 minutes had come from a Renault UE Chenilette with a stolen gun and a French mechanic who understood leverage. Lecomte walked back to his shop. He wrapped his burned arm in cloth from his workbench. He cleaned the laceration on his forehead with machine oil and pressed a rag against it until it stopped bleeding. He sat down on an overturned oil drum and remained sitting until the sound in his ears began to differentiate into separate sounds again. The first distinct sound he recognized was French voices, not German. He walked outside and saw 2 British soldiers and a French civilian walking up the road from the north. The British soldiers were from an advance reconnaissance element. They had been through Tilly-sur-Selle 20 minutes earlier and found it empty of German forces. They were confused by the burning vehicles in the orchard. They were looking for whoever had done that. Lecomte told them he had done it. The British soldiers looked at the burning Renault by the cider mill wall. They looked at Lecomte, who was covered in soot and blood and machine oil and had a rag pressed against his forehead. One of them asked what he had used. Lecomte told them, a Renault UE Chenilette and a Flak 38. The soldier looked at the burning Renault again. He said, with the specific understatement that the British Army had perfected across 2 centuries of military service, that it appeared to have been effective. In the weeks after the liberation of Tilly-sur-Seule, British military intelligence officers interviewed Lecomte twice. The interviews were recorded and filed at the War Office in London. They remained in the archives for 30 years before a historian reviewing French resistance activity in Normandy found them and recognized what they contained. The intelligence officers had asked Lecomte technical questions. How had he mounted the gun? What modifications had he made to the Renault's suspension? How had he calculated his movement intervals? Their interest was engineering. They wanted to understand if the Renault Flak configuration could be replicated, whether a field improvised self-propelled anti-aircraft gun could be produced from captured equipment in other sectors. Lecomte answered their questions with the precision of a man who had spent 9 years diagnosing problems by asking the right questions. He described the mounting brackets, the bolt specifications, the weight distribution calculation, the suspension adjustment. He drew diagrams. The intelligence officers had them photographed. But the question that produced the most interesting answer was not technical, it was tactical. The senior officer, a major from the Royal Engineers, asked Lecomte how he had decided where to position himself and how to sequence his fire. Lecomte thought about this for a moment. Then he said that he had thought about it the way he thought about a difficult engine repair. You do not attack the most obvious symptom first. You identify the component whose failure will cause the most subsequent failures. You fix that component first. Everything else follows from restoring that function. In the German battalion, the component whose failure would cause the most subsequent failures was not the leading infantry, it was the officers. The leading infantry could advance without orders because they had a direction. The main body could not adapt without orders because they had a situation that required interpretation. The rear element could not commit without orders because they could not see what was happening ahead of them. Remove the officers, and you had a formation that was still physically present but operationally fragmented. The Flak 38's first target had been the command vehicles, not the most numerous target, not the easiest target, not the target that felt most immediately threatening, the highest leverage target. The major wrote this down. He asked Lecomte where he had learned this principle. Lecomte said he had learned it from a tractor that kept breaking down at harvest time. You learned quickly that repairing the symptom cost you an afternoon. Identifying the cause cost you an hour and saved you the rest of the season. The major closed his notebook. He told Lecomte that what he had described was, more or less, the operational principle behind the entire concept of mobile combined arms warfare that the British Army had spent 3 years trying to teach its officers. Lecomte said he had no opinion on that. He was a mechanic. The Renault UE Chignette burned for 4 hours in the field beside the cider mill. By the time it stopped burning, there was nothing left that a museum would have wanted. The Flak 38 had been destroyed by the ammunition cooking off in the fire. The angle iron brackets, the salvaged German bolts sorted into coffee tins, the 11 hours of improvised engineering that had produced a machine no military procurement office would have approved, all of it was ash and twisted steel in a Norman field. The German battalion that had moved through the Tilly-sur-Selle orchard on the morning of June 7th was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit by the end of that day. The leading elements caught by British armor pushing south from Gold Beach, the rear elements accounted for by the typhoons, the survivors scattered into the bocage to be gathered up individually over the following week. The 57 minutes that Lecomte had taken from the battalion's schedule were not recorded in any operational summary as decisive. The military calculus of Normandy operated at scales that made 57 minutes in one village seem like rounding error. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, weeks of fighting across a front that stretched from the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the Orne River. But battles are not composed of large things. They are composed of small things accumulating. 57 minutes here, a road held for 2 hours there, a position maintained past the point where rational calculation suggested it should have been abandoned. The aggregate of individual moments of improvisation and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that the situation was beyond response. Henri Lecomte received the Médaille Militaire from the French Provisional Government in 1945. He received the King's Medal for Courage in the Cause of Freedom from the British government in 1946. The citations described his actions in language that was formal and correct, and captured very little of what had actually happened in that orchard. He returned to his shop in Tilly-sur-Selle in 1944 and repaired farm equipment for another 22 years. He rarely spoke about the morning of June 7th, except when asked directly, and even then he spoke about it in the language of mechanics rather than soldiers. He talked about weight distribution and bolt specifications, and the importance of identifying the highest leverage point of intervention. He did not talk about courage because he did not think courage was the accurate description of what he had done. Courage was for men who acted against their nature. Lecomte had acted according to his nature. He was a mechanic who had seen a problem and identified the tools available and determined that the tools were sufficient if applied correctly. The problem was a German battalion. The tools were a rusted tractor and a stolen gun, and 9 years of understanding how machines worked when pushed past their rated capacity. He was right that the tools were sufficient. He opened his shop again in September of 1944. The first customer was a farmer whose tractor had broken down during the harvest. Lecomte diagnosed the problem in 10 minutes, a worn governor spring, a 2-hour repair. The farmer was back in his field by afternoon. Lecomte said later that this had been a satisfying day's work. He meant the tractor repair. The orchard was a different kind of work, from a different kind of morning, when the tools at hand were all there were, and the calculation pointed only in one direction, and a mechanic who understood leverage had no option except to apply it. The Germans had called his tractor the kitchen machine, something for the backfields, something beneath consideration. On the morning of June 7, 1944, it had been enough.